Welcome to a captivating new Victorian tale that will leave you breathless. If you love stories of unexpected love, second chances, and the transformative power of true connection, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for weekly stories that will touch your heart. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our emotionally powerful narratives. The autumn rain pelted the stone steps of St. Margaret's Church with relentless fury, each drop seeming to echo the humiliation that coursed through Lady Evangeline Ashworth's veins. She stood alone in her ivory silk wedding gown, the delicate French lace now sodden and clinging to her trembling form, while guests whispered behind gloved hands and slowly filtered out of the chapel. The man who was supposed to be her husband had fled 2 hours ago, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note and the ruins of what should have been the happiest day of her life. Evangeline, I cannot go through with this marriage. The scandal surrounding your father's debts and the whispers about your family's disgrace make it impossible. I have departed for the continent and will not return. Forgive me, Charles. She clutched the crumpled letter in her white-gloved hand, the ink slightly smeared from her tears. 23 years old, with striking auburn hair and emerald eyes that had once been called the most beautiful in all of London society, Evangeline now felt like nothing more than damaged goods. Her father's gambling debts had destroyed their family fortune, and the scandal had spread through the town like wildfire. Charles Pemberton had been her last hope for a respectable marriage, and now even he had abandoned her at the altar. "My lady," whispered her maid, Sarah, approaching cautiously with a woolen cloak. "Perhaps we should return home." But what home? Evangeline thought bitterly. The bailiffs had seized Ashworth Manor 3 days ago. She had nowhere to go, no family willing to take her in after the scandal, and no prospects for the future. The wedding guests had all departed, some shaking their heads in pity, others barely concealing their satisfaction at seeing the once proud Ashworth family brought so low. As she stood there in the empty churchyard, the rain soaking through her wedding veil, a deep voice cut through the storm. "Miss Ashworth." She turned to see a tall figure approaching through the mist and rain. The man was imposing, dressed in a perfectly tailored black coat that spoke of wealth and position. As he drew closer, she could make out aristocratic features, dark hair slightly damp from the rain, and eyes of such a piercing blue they seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Your Grace," she said, recognizing the Duke of Ravenshollow from his rare appearances at London society functions. Alexander Blackthorne was known as the Shadow Duke, a man who had withdrawn from society after some personal tragedy years ago. What was he doing here? "I heard about your circumstances," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I have a proposition for you." Evangeline stared at him, water dripping from her sodden hair. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Your Grace." "You need protection and a respectable position. I need a wife to manage my household and serve as hostess for necessary social functions. It would be a marriage of convenience, nothing more. You would have your own quarters, your own life, but the protection of my name and title." The offer was so unexpected, so preposterous that Evangeline almost laughed. "You're proposing to marry me? Here, now, after I've just been abandoned at the altar?" "I am offering you a solution to your current predicament," he replied calmly. "The vicar is still inside. We could be wed within the hour, and you would never have to face the humiliation of returning to London as a jilted bride." Evangeline studied his face, trying to understand his motives. The Duke of Ravenshollow was wealthy beyond measure, titled, and despite his reputation as a recluse, still one of the most eligible bachelors in England. Why would he offer marriage to a ruined woman he barely knew? "What do you gain from this arrangement, Your Grace?" she asked suspiciously. "Privacy," he said simply. "A wife will stop the parade of ambitious mothers trying to match me with their daughters. You would be the perfect solution, as you ask for nothing beyond protection and respectability." Sarah gasped behind her, but Evangeline found herself seriously considering the offer. What other choice did she have? The workhouse? Becoming a governess or companion to some distant relative who would treat her as little better than a servant? At least as the Duke's wife, she would have dignity, even if the marriage was merely a business arrangement. "I need your word that this would be a marriage in name only," she said finally. "You have it," he replied without hesitation. "I require no more from you than competent household management and the occasional appearance at social functions. Your person and your privacy will be entirely your own." Evangeline looked back at the church, then at the Duke's waiting carriage, its coat of arms gleaming even in the grey afternoon light. It was a choice between certain ruin and uncertain salvation. "Very well," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I accept your proposal." 20 minutes later, Evangeline stood once again at the altar of St. Margaret's Church, but this time beside a man she barely knew. The elderly vicar, though clearly bewildered by the strange turn of events, performed the ceremony with dignity. There were no guests save Sarah and the Duke's silent coachman as witnesses, no flowers or music, just the simple exchange of vows that would bind her to this mysterious man. When the Duke was instructed to kiss his bride, he merely lifted her hand to his lips in a gesture of formal respect, but as he did so, something extraordinary happened. As he raised his eyes to look at her face properly for the first time, without the veil and shadow of her humiliation obscuring his view, he froze completely. His blue eyes widened in what appeared to be shock, and the color drained from his face as if he had seen a ghost. His hand, still holding hers, began to tremble slightly, and he stared at her with an expression of such stunned recognition that Evangeline felt her own breath catch. "Your Grace?" she whispered, concerned by his sudden pallor. "Are you quite well?" For a long moment he seemed unable to speak or move, as if her face had rendered him completely immobile. Then, with what appeared to be tremendous effort, he collected himself and stepped back. "Forgive me," he said, his voice rougher than before. You bear a remarkable resemblance to someone I once knew." "Someone important to you?" Evangeline asked gently. "Someone who died long ago," he replied curtly, then turned to address the vicar with apparent determination to end the conversation. "Thank you for your services, Father Morrison. We must be away before the weather worsens." As they left the church together, Evangeline couldn't shake the memory of that moment when he had truly seen her face. There had been something in his eyes beyond mere surprise, a depth of emotion that suggested her resemblance to this mysterious dead woman was more significant than he was willing to admit. The carriage ride to Ravenshollow Castle passed in tense silence. The Duke sat rigidly across from her, his gaze fixed firmly out the window, while Evangeline tried to process the surreal events of the day. She had awakened that morning expecting to become Mrs. Charles Pemberton, and now she was the Duchess of Ravenshollow, bound to a man who seemed to find the very sight of her face deeply disturbing. As the imposing towers of Ravenshollow Castle came into view through the carriage windows, Evangeline wondered what she had truly gotten herself into. The Duke had offered her protection and respectability, but at what cost? And who was the dead woman she apparently resembled so closely that her new husband could barely look at her? The answers to these questions would have to wait. But as the carriage rolled through the castle gates into her new life, Evangeline couldn't shake the feeling that this marriage of convenience might prove to be far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. Ravenshollow Castle was even more imposing than Evangeline had imagined, its Gothic towers and battlements rising against the storm clouds like something from a medieval romance. As their carriage rolled through the massive iron gates, She caught glimpses of expansive gardens, ornate fountains, and ivy-covered walls that spoke of centuries of noble heritage. This was to be her home now, though whether it would feel like a sanctuary or a prison remained to be seen. The Duke had barely spoken during the 2-hour journey from the church, maintaining his rigid posture and avoiding her gaze with what seemed like deliberate effort. Evangeline found herself stealing glances at his profile, trying to understand the man she had just married. His features were aristocratic and well-formed, but there was a hardness to them, as if he had trained himself not to feel too deeply. Only when she had caught him looking at her in the church had she seen any crack in that carefully constructed facade. Upon their arrival, they were met by a small army of servants lined up in the grand entrance hall. The butler, an elderly man with impeccable posture and kind eyes, stepped forward with a respectful bow. "Your Grace, welcome home," he said to the Duke before turning to Evangeline. "Your Grace, may I say on behalf of the entire staff how honored we are to welcome the new Duchess to Ravenshollow." "Thank you," Evangeline replied, touched by the warmth in his voice. "I look forward to meeting everyone properly." "Thornton will show you to your chambers," the Duke said abruptly, speaking directly to the butler rather than to her. "See that her Grace has everything she requires. I shall be in my study." With that, he strode away across the marble floor, his footsteps echoing in the vast space, leaving Evangeline standing alone in her wedding dress, surrounded by servants she didn't know in a castle that was now supposed to be her home. "If you would follow me, Your Grace," Thornton said diplomatically, clearly accustomed to his master's brusque manner, "I believe you'll find your apartments most comfortable." As they climbed the grand staircase, Evangeline noticed the portraits lining the walls. Generations of Blackthorns gazed down at her with serious expressions, and she wondered what they would think of this strange new addition to their family line. At the top of the stairs, Thornton led her down a long corridor, hung with rich tapestries, until they reached a set of double doors. "The Duchess's chambers," he announced, opening the doors to reveal a suite of rooms that took Evangeline's breath away. The sitting room was decorated in shades of gold and cream, with elegant furnishings and tall windows that overlooked the castle gardens. Beyond it, she could see a bedroom with a magnificent 4-poster bed and a private dressing room. "These rooms haven't been occupied for many years," Thornton said quietly, "but we've done our best to prepare them quickly. If there's anything you require, you need only ring." "They're beautiful," Evangeline said honestly, though she couldn't help wondering about the previous occupant. "Who lived here before?" Thornton's expression became carefully neutral. "The late Duchess, Your Grace, the Duke's first wife." "First wife?" The words escaped before Evangeline could stop them. The Duke had failed to mention he had been married before. "Lady Catherine Blackthorn," Thornton said, his voice gentle but guarded. "She passed away 5 years ago. Consumption. It was. Very difficult for His Grace." Understanding began to dawn on Evangeline. No wonder the Duke had reacted so strangely when he saw her face clearly for the first time. She must bear some resemblance to his deceased first wife, the woman who had occupied these very rooms. "I see," she said quietly. "That explains much." Thornton regarded her with shrewd eyes. "You're very understanding, Your Grace. Many ladies would be troubled by such circumstances." "I'm not most ladies, Thornton," Evangeline replied with a slight smile, "and this is hardly a conventional marriage. I think understanding will be essential for all of us. Indeed, Your Grace, shall I send up some tea, and perhaps we might discuss the household arrangements when you're settled?" "That would be wonderful. Thank you." After Thornton left, Evangeline explored her new quarters more thoroughly. In the bedroom, she discovered a portrait hanging above the fireplace that made her stop dead in her tracks. It showed a beautiful woman with auburn hair and green eyes, wearing a gown of deep blue silk. The resemblance was striking, though not exact. Lady Catherine had been smaller in stature and her features more delicate, but the colouring was remarkably similar. Sarah arrived with Evangeline's few possessions, having travelled with the luggage. "Oh, my lady," she breathed, looking around the luxurious rooms, "it's like a fairy tale." "Hardly," Evangeline said dryly, but without bitterness, "though it's certainly better than our alternatives." That evening, Evangeline dressed carefully for dinner, choosing a simple but elegant gown of deep green silk that complemented her colouring. She had no idea what to expect from her first formal meal with the Duke, but she was determined to fulfill her part of their bargain with dignity and grace. The dining room was magnificent, with a table that could easily seat 20 people, though only 2 places had been set at one end. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the polished mahogany and gleaming silver, and Evangeline couldn't help but feel somewhat overwhelmed by the grandeur. The Duke arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, dressed impeccably in evening wear. He had clearly made an effort to compose himself since their arrival, though she noticed he still seemed to have difficulty meeting her eyes directly. "I trust your rooms are satisfactory?" he asked as they were seated. "More than satisfactory. They're beautiful, though I understand they once belonged to your first wife." His fork paused halfway to his mouth, and she saw his jaw tighten. "Yes, I should have mentioned that. If you would prefer different quarters." "Not at all," Evangeline said quickly. "I simply wanted you to know that I understand why my appearance might be unsettling for you." They ate in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the clink of silverware against china and the distant rumble of thunder outside. Finally, the Duke spoke again. "You must think me quite mad, offering marriage to a complete stranger," he said, still not quite looking at her. "Not mad, practical perhaps, though I confess I'm curious about your true motivations. I told you the truth. I needed a wife to handle social obligations and keep matchmaking mothers at bay. The circumstances made you an ideal candidate." "Because I'm ruined goods," Evangeline said matter-of-factly. "Because you require protection without romantic expectations," he corrected firmly. "Your circumstances were unfortunate, not shameful. The fault lies with your father's poor judgment and your former fiancé's cowardice, not with you." His defense of her was unexpected and touched her more than she cared to admit. "That's kind of you to say. It's merely the truth." He finally looked directly at her, and she saw him steel himself against whatever emotion her face provoked. "I want you to know that despite any personal difficulties I may have adjusting to your presence here, I will honor our agreement completely. You will be treated with the respect due to a duchess, and you will have my protection in all things. And in return, I shall strive to be the sort of wife you require," Evangeline replied, "though I hope you might eventually feel comfortable telling me about Lady Catherine. It might help us both if I understood the nature of our resemblance and what it means to you." The Duke's expression shuttered immediately. "That subject is not open for discussion, ever." "I understand. For now." "Not for now. Ever," he repeated more firmly. Evangeline inclined her head graciously, though privately she doubted he could maintain such rigid control indefinitely. She had seen the depth of emotion in his eyes when he first truly looked at her face, and pain that deep couldn't be suppressed forever. In the weeks that followed, Evangeline settled into her role as Duchess of Ravenshollow with a grace that impressed even the most skeptical members of the staff. She met with the housekeeper each morning to review household matters, corresponded with the estate manager about tenant concerns, and gradually familiarized herself with the vast network of responsibilities that came with managing one of England's great houses. The Duke, true to his word, treated her with unfailing courtesy and respect, though he maintained a careful distance that sometimes felt more like a wall. He took his meals in his study most evenings, claiming urgent business matters, and when they did dine together, conversation remained strictly limited to practical matters. Yet Evangeline began to notice small things that suggested he was more aware of her than he pretended. Fresh flowers appeared in her sitting room daily, always white roses, which she later learned from Thornton had been Lady Catherine's favourites. The library, which the Duke had given her permission to use freely, had been quietly reorganized so that the novels and poetry collections were more easily accessible. And one morning she discovered that the squeaking hinge on her bedroom door had been silently repaired during the night. It was during her third week at Ravens Hollow that Evangeline first ventured into the portrait gallery, a long room lined with paintings of the Blackthorn ancestors. She moved slowly along the walls, studying the faces of dukes and duchesses past, until she reached the far end where the most recent portraits hung. There, in a place of honor, was a large painting of Lady Catherine Blackthorn. Evangeline stood before it for a long time, studying the delicate features and gentle expression. The resemblance was indeed marked, though Catherine had been ethereally beautiful in a way that Evangeline knew she herself was not. This woman had clearly been beloved, and the artist had captured something luminous and tender in her face. She was everything good in this world. Evangeline turned to find the Duke standing in the doorway, his expression unguarded for once as he gazed at the portrait. He looked haggard, as if he hadn't been sleeping well. "She was very beautiful," Evangeline said gently. "Beautiful, yes, but that was the least of her qualities." He moved to stand beside Evangeline, his eyes never leaving the painting. Catherine was kind to everyone, from the highest lord to the humblest servant. She had a way of making everyone feel as though they mattered, as though their concerns were the most important thing in the world to her. "How did you meet her?" "At her debut ball. She was 17, fresh from the country, and completely overwhelmed by London society. Some of the other young ladies were mocking her because her gowns weren't quite fashionable, and she didn't know all the latest gossip. I asked her to dance simply to rescue her from their cruelty, but by the end of the evening, I was completely bewitched." There was a tenderness in his voice that Evangeline had never heard before, and it made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "She sounds wonderful," she said sincerely. She was. "We had 7 years together before the consumption took her. 7 years that weren't nearly enough." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "When I saw your face clearly for the first time in the church, it was like seeing her ghost. The coloring, the bone structure. For one impossible moment, I thought." "I'm sorry," Evangeline said softly. "I can only imagine how difficult that must have been." "You have nothing to apologize for. If anything, I should apologize to you. I haven't been entirely fair in our arrangement. You've been perfectly honorable." "No," he interrupted, turning to look at her directly for the first time in weeks. "I've been hiding from you because looking at you reminds me of what I've lost. But that's not your fault, and you don't deserve to be treated as though you're some painful reminder rather than a person in your own right." Evangeline felt something shift between them, as if a wall had developed its first crack. "We both entered this marriage for practical reasons," she reminded him. "Neither of us expected it to be easy. Perhaps not, but I promised you protection and respect, and I haven't been giving you the latter. You've handled your responsibilities here with intelligence and grace. You've been kind to the staff, and you've asked for nothing beyond what we agreed upon. You deserve better from me." "What are you suggesting?" "That perhaps we might try to be friends, rather than simply two strangers sharing a name and a roof." The offer was tentative, almost vulnerable, and Evangeline realized how much courage it must have taken for him to make it. "I would like that very much." Would you join me for dinner tonight? In the dining room, not hiding in my study like a coward? Of course. That evening marked the beginning of a subtle but significant change in their relationship. The Duke, Alexander as she now thought of him, began to emerge from behind his walls of grief and reserve. He told her stories about the estate's history, asked her opinions on matters of household management, and gradually began to treat her as a partner rather than a stranger. Evangeline found herself looking forward to their evening conversations with an anticipation that surprised her. Alexander was intelligent, well-read, and when he allowed himself to relax, possessed of a dry humor that made her laugh despite herself. She began to see glimpses of the man Catherine must have fallen in love with, and it both warmed her heart and troubled her in ways she didn't want to examine too closely. One evening, about a month after their conversation in the portrait gallery, Alexander surprised her by asking, "Tell me about your life before all this. What were you like as a child?" "Spoiled, probably," Evangeline admitted with a rueful smile. "I was my father's only child, and he indulged me terribly. I had the best tutors, the finest clothes, and every book I could want. I thought the whole world was like our little corner of it." "When did you realize it wasn't?" "When the debts began mounting, and father started gambling more desperately to try to recover our losses. I watched him change from a loving, if somewhat irresponsible man into someone I barely recognized. The worse things became, the more he gambled, until there was nothing left. That must have been frightening, terrifying. Not just the poverty, but watching someone you love destroy themselves and being powerless to stop it." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "I think that's why Charles's betrayal hurt so much. I had hoped that marriage might provide some stability, some safety, to have that ripped away at the last moment." "He was a fool," Alexander said firmly. "Any man who would abandon a woman he claimed to love simply because of financial difficulties isn't worthy of her." "Perhaps, but it taught me that love isn't always enough. Sometimes practical considerations matter more than feelings." "Is that what you believe? That love isn't enough?" Evangeline considered the question carefully. "I think love without security can be wonderful but fragile, and security without love can be comfortable but empty. I suppose the ideal would be to have both." "Yes," Alexander said quietly, his eyes distant. "The ideal would be both." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely, and for a moment she thought she saw longing in his expression, but then he seemed to catch himself, and the moment passed. "I should retire," he said, rising from his chair. "Thank you for dinner, Evangeline, and for your company." "Thank you for asking me to join you. Good night, Alexander." As he left the dining room, Evangeline remained at the table, turning their conversation over in her mind. Something was changing between them, something neither of them had anticipated when they made their practical arrangement. She was beginning to care for him, to enjoy his company not just as a means of survival, but for its own sake. And unless she was very much mistaken, he was beginning to see her as something more than just a convenient solution to his problems. The question was whether either of them was ready to acknowledge what was happening, or whether they would continue to hide behind the safety of their marriage of convenience until it was too late to become something more. Winter had settled over Ravenshollow Castle with a gentle beauty that transformed the estate into a wonderland of snow-covered gardens and frost-etched windows. Evangeline had been the Duchess of Ravenshollow for 3 months now, and the role had become as natural to her as breathing. More importantly, her friendship with Alexander had deepened into something that made her heart race whenever he entered a room, though she dared not examine these feelings too closely. Their evening conversations had become the highlight of her days, ranging from spirited debates about literature and politics to quieter moments when Alexander would share memories of his childhood or his dreams for improving conditions for the estate's tenants. He had begun to smile more often, and sometimes Evangeline caught him looking at her with an expression that made her wonder if their marriage of convenience was evolving into something neither of them had expected. It was on a particularly cold December evening that everything changed. Evangeline had been in the library, curled up in her favorite chair by the fire with a book of poetry, when she heard a commotion in the corridor outside. Shouting voices, running footsteps, and then Alexander's voice, sharp with authority and concern. She quickly set aside her book and hurried to the door, opening it to find chaos in the normally serene hallway. Servants were rushing back and forth with blankets and hot water, and she could hear Alexander giving rapid orders to Thornton. "Oh, what's happened?" she asked the butler as he hurried past. "Accident at the village inn, Your Grace. A fire broke out and several people were injured. His Grace has ordered them brought here since the local doctor is away visiting his daughter." Without hesitation, Evangeline lifted her skirts and hurried toward the commotion. She found Alexander in the blue salon, which had been hastily converted into a makeshift infirmary. A young woman lay on the sofa, unconscious and badly burned, while an elderly man sat in a chair holding his injured arm. Two small children huddled together near the fireplace, their eyes wide with shock and fear. "Alexander," Evangeline said quietly, touching his arm, "what can I do to help?" "Evangeline, you shouldn't. This isn't something a duchess should," he began, but she cut him off. "I'm not just a duchess right now. I'm a woman who can help. Tell me what needs to be done." Something in her voice, calm and determined, seemed to steady him. "The children need comfort and care. The woman Mary is the worst injured, and Thomas here has a broken arm that needs setting. I'll tend to the children first, then help with Mary," Evangeline said, already moving toward the frightened pair by the fireplace. What followed were the longest hours of Evangeline's life, but also the most meaningful. She comforted the children, telling them stories and singing softly, while Alexander and the makeshift medical team worked on the injured adults. When Mary's fever spiked dangerously in the early morning hours, Evangeline sat by her bedside, cooling her forehead with damp cloths and murmuring prayers. It was during that long night that Alexander truly saw her, not as a convenient wife or a painful reminder of Catherine, but as herself. Evangeline was gentle with the children, but firm when they needed guidance. She was calm in crisis, but passionate in her determination to help. She had torn strips from her own silk petticoat to make bandages without a moment's hesitation. And when Mary had cried out in delirium for her dead mother, Evangeline had held her hand and sung the lullabies her own mother had sung to her years ago. As dawn broke over the snow-covered estate, Mary's fever finally broke and the immediate crisis passed. Thomas was resting comfortably with his arm properly set, and the children had fallen asleep, curled up together under blankets near the dying fire. Alexander found Evangeline in the corridor outside the blue salon, slumped against the wall with exhaustion. Her hair had come loose from its pins hours ago. Her dress was stained with blood and soot, and she looked utterly spent. "Evangeline," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "You should rest. I'll have Sarah help you to your rooms." "Is everyone going to be all right?" she asked, her eyes struggling to focus. "Yes, thanks largely to you. You were incredible tonight." "I just did what needed to be done." "No," Alexander said firmly, helping her to her feet. "You did far more than that. You opened your home and your heart to strangers. You worked tirelessly to save Mary's life, and you comforted those children as if they were your own. What you did tonight, Catherine would have done exactly the same thing." Evangeline looked at him in surprise, It was the first time he had compared her favorably to Catherine, rather than simply noting their physical resemblance. "She would have been better at it," Evangeline said wearily. "No," Alexander said, his voice rough with emotion. "She couldn't have been better because you were perfect. You were brave and compassionate and strong, and I—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "Alexander? I've been such a fool," he said quietly. "I've been so afraid of betraying Catherine's memory that I almost let myself miss the extraordinary woman standing right in front of me." Evangeline's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere in these past months, my marriage of convenience has become something else entirely. I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you, Evangeline, not as a replacement for Catherine, but as yourself. You're nothing like her, and that's exactly why I love you." "Alexander," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I know this wasn't part of our agreement," he continued, his hands coming up to frame her face gently. "I know you married me for protection, not love. But I can't pretend anymore that you're simply a convenient wife. You've become everything to me." "Do you want to know a secret?" Evangeline asked, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "I stopped thinking of this as a marriage of convenience weeks ago. I've been falling in love with you too, Alexander, but I was terrified to hope you might feel the same." "You love me." The wonder in his voice made her heart ache with tenderness. "Completely, desperately. I love your kindness to the tenants, your devotion to this estate, the way you make me laugh when you're teasing me about my terrible French pronunciation. I love how you've honored Catherine's memory while still allowing yourself to live again." Alexander's response was to kiss her with all the passion and longing that had been building between them for months. It was nothing like the formal brush of lips at their wedding, but a real kiss between two people who had found unexpected love in the most unlikely circumstances. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "Will you marry me again?" he asked softly. "Not for convenience this time, but for love?" "I thought we were already married," Evangeline said with a shaky laugh. "We are, legally. But I want to marry you with all of our friends and family present, with flowers and music and joy. I want to vow to love you for exactly who you are, and I want the whole world to know that you're my wife, because I adore you, not because I needed a convenient arrangement." "Yes," Evangeline whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you again. I'll marry you as many times as you like." 6 months later, on a beautiful spring day, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshollow renewed their vows in the village church where they had first met. This time, the church was filled with friends and tenants who had come to celebrate a love story that had begun with abandonment and humiliation, but had transformed into something beautiful. As they exchanged rings again, this time looking into each other's eyes with complete adoration, Evangeline thought about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been the bride no one wanted, standing alone in the rain outside a church, and now she was the most beloved duchess in the county, married to a man who treasured her exactly as she was. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with passion, but with kindness. Sometimes the perfect match is found not in similarity, but in the ways two people complement and strengthen each other. And sometimes, when life seems to offer only endings, it's actually preparing for the most beautiful beginning of all. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If you loved discovering how true love can bloom from the most unexpected circumstances, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming Victorian romances. Hit that notification bell and let us know in the comments which love story you'd like us to tell next.